That would be the opinion of MI5. That would not be my opinion. It was the considered opinion of MI5, who did a report called the Little Report between 1945 and 1946. Really ahead of its time thinking. They were basically saying, let's assess this now. Let's let this inform future decision making if we ever find ourselves in a future war. Their opinion was that Ireland was a more use neutral. They came to the simple conclusion, and it's a very obvious one.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 186 for the 2nd of April 2026.
How did we go from fighting a revolution over a 2% tax on a breakfast beverage to what we pay today? And we're taxed on money when we receive it, when we spend it, when we keep it, when we invest it, and even when we die with it.
I came across this on social media. It's obviously an American anti-tax rant. He's talking about a tax on a breakfast beverage. That's obviously a reference to the Boston Tea Party, when, according to legend, American colonists protested against a British tax on tea. I think that the reality is a bit more complicated, but it's the legend that's important here.
It gets worse. We commute to work to make that money in a car that is taxed again to register on roads we're already taxed to build, fueled by gas that is taxed even further, and many times through tolls that tax you again. And that's to maintain bridges and highways and tunnels that already have billions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, allocated to them, and they're still falling apart.
So we get the idea. The guy doesn't like taxes. I'm pretty sure nobody does. But there's a confusion here between two different issues. One is how much tax we pay. How much of our income through one tax or another ends up being taken by the taxman. That's a real issue that deserves debate, especially since it has a big impact on how lots of other things in the economy work. The second issue here is how the tax system works and, in particular for this guy, how many different types of taxes there are and what they are levied on. That's another important debate, and the outcome of that debate also has a big impact on how the economy works. But I think that clip illustrates the real confusion here that I want to talk about. There are two issues. These two debates are totally separate issues, and they often get confused. And I think that confusion makes the two separate debates on these two separate issues run into the sand and really go nowhere. The first debate is about how much money should the government take. In fact, it's really easy to at least measure what's being done here, because I can find on Wikipedia a list of countries and their total tax revenue expressed as a percent of their GDP. This can be calculated in a couple of different ways, and the page actually lists two listings, one compiled by the World Bank, another by the UN. These figures can vary because of different methodology, but in the UN measure, tax is basically defined as any money the government takes in by any means, with a couple of exceptions like fines imposed by courts. And I'm going by that where it's available. So things like PRSI in Ireland and social security contributions in the US are counted as tax, as are the cost of getting your driving license, whether it's described as a tax or as a purchase price. When you look at the list, you can see that at the bottom of the list, the countries that collect the least in taxes are some failed states like Somalia and Haiti, where there is no effective government to collect the taxes, along with oil-rich states, where I presume governments are funded by the profits of nationalised oil companies. Libya is at the absolute bottom. I think that it might count as both. Their tax as a percent of GDP is in the low single digits. Unsurprisingly, the countries at the top of the list include the Scandinavian and Western European social democracies. Denmark is at 47%, so nearly half of the total GDP goes to the government. Sweden, New Zealand, Iceland, Norway and France all range between 30 and 35%. Ireland comes in at 18%, close to the middle of the rankings, but I think that figure is distorted downwards by our artificially inflated GDP figures. For the American in that clip, the US comes in at a slightly higher 20%, so not that high, but I think that doesn't count the cost of non-state healthcare, which is gigantic in the US. As I said, there is a real debate to be had here. Should the state spend more to provide a social safety net for its people, or does that cause inefficiency? Would the economy grow more if that was left to the market? In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan talked about the Laffer curve and said the lower the taxes the better, because the state can get more income with lower taxes because that stimulates more economic activity which can be taxed at that lower rate. There's certainly some truth to this. The Laffer curve is basically a semicircle which starts at zero. If your tax rate is zero, then for sure you're going to get zero tax revenue, but it ends at 0 too, which seems right because if you tax everything at 100%, then nobody will do anything because they won't get paid anything, and again, you get zero tax revenue. The two extremes of tax rates yield nothing, and the optimum point is somewhere in between, and it's important to remember here that optimum is a value judgment, not something that can be calculated definitively by a graph. Some people think that having taxes as low as practically possible is the optimum. Other people think that it's maximizing revenue or funding specific services. Anyway, the Laffer curve doesn't claim that all tax reduces economic activity. As I said, Haiti and Somalia have very low tax takes, but these are lawless states with very little economic activity because they're so insecure that anything anyone makes is sure to be stolen. If you could impose a tax to pay for an effective police force in Haiti or Somalia to provide security, those countries would be economically far better off. In that example, higher taxes would create more economic activity, and there are many more examples. So yes, lower taxes generally tend to stimulate economic activity, but that effect has its limits, and it doesn't always work, and sometimes it works the other way. The world just isn't as simple as the anti-tax extremists would like it to be. Like most things in political economy, it's complicated. And that leads me back to the rant that I started with. Many people complain not so much about the level of taxes, but the complexity of them.
And then when you get to your office that is taxed to exist, in a corporation that is also taxed to do business, that almost certainly requires permits and other things, which are another tax, you are paid a paycheck that the corporation must match another payroll tax on top of what they have to pay you. Then you go to a home of which you are taxed to own every single year that we bought with money that the government already taxed us on.
Note that this guy doesn't mention the rate of a single one of the taxes he's complaining about. This is a really important economic effect, and it's completely irrational. It's not unlike the question about whether you'd go an hour out of your way to pay €200 for a washing machine that's available to you for €300 next door. Most people would. But would you go an hour out of your way to get €100 off a €50,000 car? Most people wouldn't bother, even though the money and the time cost are identical, and you tend to buy both with roughly equal frequency. Humans aren't always logical. For the same reason, it seems very appealing to people, even when they understand they would pay the same total amount of tax. It's very appealing to pay it all in one lump sum, rather than have lots of little taxes like PAYE, VAT, car tax, property tax, bin charges, and many more. In their first iteration, Renewa, remember them? They still exist, believe it or not. They've gone through several phases and now come out as full-on anti-immigration, anti-EU. Ironic, given their founder. Anyway, in their first iteration, Renewa promised something like this, just one flat-rate income tax. It didn't go anywhere, obviously, but this idea does attract some positive comment sometimes. And it is an attractive idea, particularly because it appeals to that irrational bit of us that would go across town to save €100 on a washing machine but not on a car. The problem is that, to use the words of H.L. Mencken, for every problem there is a solution that is simple, neat, and wrong. And this is a prime example. First off, let me acknowledge that in some cases, simplifying the tax code can reduce the collection costs and also the compliance costs for citizens, but that's really tweaking the edges. The real effect here is that taxes cause what economists call behavioural responses. People change what they do in response to taxes. We can use this for good effects: higher taxes on cigarettes, reduce smoking, lower taxes on school books, and so on. But this means that unintended consequences are a big issue here. If we tax one area of the economy and not another, experience has shown that this distorts economic activity and produces perverse results. One example is that in Britain, gingerbread men are not allowed to smile. I'm not kidding. British VAT is not imposed on biscuits unless they're chocolate covered, which is considered a luxury. But how covered in chocolate do they have to be to attract the wrath of the VAT man? Is a tiny bit of chocolate allowed? Yes, that's okay. The gingerbread man can have chocolate eyes, but a mouth? No. That's too close to making it chocolate covered. So the result is that all gingerbread men in Britain can have chocolate eyes, but not a mouth, so no smile. That's a humorous effect. Other effects are not so harmless. In Ireland, we have almost no taxes on property, either directly on the property itself or indirectly on water supply or the like. The taxes that you and I pay are overwhelmingly either on our income or on our purchases, like VAT. It won't take you long in any political discussion forum to come across ferocious opposition to the minuscule property tax that we have to pay. And there's no shortage of people who will puff themselves into a tizzy with all sorts of claims that property tax is an outrageous infringement on their moral right to live free, as though they were trekking on the Oregon Trail. Their argument is simple, neat, and wrong. Our tax system is massively unbalanced, with far more tax on economic activity, earning and spending money, and far less tax on economic inactivity, owning property. The effect of this is that our economy is focused on unproductive property ownership at the expense of actually producing anything. Remember that in the low-tax US, depending on where they live, many people will pay more tax on their house than on their wages. Many states have no state income tax at all, so people just pay the federal income tax, and the state is funded largely by property taxes. What does this do? Well, higher income taxes deter economic activity. That's just economics 101. Taxes have behavioural responses. If investing in property is less worthwhile, less people will do it. And if investing in economic activity is more worthwhile, that's where the investment will go. And that investment would have an impact. With investing in property less worthwhile, the utility of property as an investment vehicle is reduced, so the price of houses would reflect more their value as providing a home for someone. And that money would have to be invested somewhere. With relatively lower taxes on economic activity, that would stimulate the productive economy. So more and better paying jobs, lower tax on that pay, higher property tax, but no increase in the total amount of tax, and lower housing costs. That sounds like a win to me. Remember that the next time some gombeen comes knocking on your door, looking for a vote in return for a cut in the local property tax that's worth about the price of one chocolate bar a week. In a moment we'll have the interview, but first I want to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who donates on Patreon. We don't get a huge amount of money out of it. We're not in the big league like some other Irish podcasters, but it pays for things like web hosting, and Kevin and myself largely donate our time for free. It's also a great morale booster when we get a new patron on Patreon. It lets us know that there are people out there who listen and appreciate the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think that you could do the same as the other donors on Patreon and throw in the price of a cup of coffee once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
I'm joined on the line now by Irish historian and author, traditionally published by the History Press and the Merrion Press, John Crotty. John's most recent book, The Irish Tricolour, has given us a new understanding of the origins of Ireland's national flag and other symbols. But John's first book, on the treaty port location Spike Island, brought the story of Ireland in World War II to his attention, he having served as a CEO on the island for 6 years. And that was obviously important to the treaty ports in particular in relation to Irish neutrality in World War II. And I know you've taken an interest in that as well. We will get to that. But I want to throw you a couple of questions about the tricolour to talk about your most recent book for a moment. That was, I think, designed in 1848, which was about 60 years after the French Revolution and all the decades with Napoleon and everything. Would that flag, obviously inspired by the French tricolour, would that flag have been seen as a threat of regicide by British loyalists?
Well, this is the incredible thing, William. The first Irish tricolour actually emerged in 1830, and there's a whole new chapter of the tricolour's origins that have now been revealed. The flag was designed by a Dubliner, a forgotten female patriot, Amelia Hamilton, in September 1830, and it was adopted for the repeal campaigns of Daniel O'Connell in the end of 1830, but right throughout the early 1830s, even into the 1840s. So what we've discovered is there's an entirely new history there where the original tricolour was very much not a republican symbol. It was not a symbol of separatism. It was more a symbol of home rule. It was the idea that Ireland would have its own parliament, its own self-governing, institution, just like it had in the Act of Union. And I think the Act of Union that took away Dublin's parliament was a great loss for many Irish people. However effective it was the loss of a modicum of independence. So it does get a rebel edge, if you like, in 1848. And certainly from that point forward, when these people were espousing an independent Ireland, the Unionists were very much against this. And it did have that feeling, I think, of as regicide, as you call it.
And you, I see on your website, and I guess in the book, quote Thomas Francis Meagher, who I think previously was the person who, the flag was attributed to. And there is the quotation, "The white in the centre signifies a lasting truce between orange and green." Is it the case that that kind of white for peace symbolism or semiotics existed to the same degree in like the 1830s? Because the other explanation I had heard of that was that there was three traditions in Ireland: Catholic, Protestant and Dissenter. So Presbyterians and all of those other minor Protestant religions would not have been considered as orange. They would have been considered Dissenter.
Yes, I think the original tricolour, it came out just months after the July French Revolution in 1830, and I think its original designer would definitely have been inspired by it. She also gave it a peaceful meaning. She said, "Let orange and green no longer be seen bestained by the blood of our island." So she has certainly seen it as a peaceful symbol, and I think the white in the French flag, has been inspirational for her as well. But, you're absolutely correct. It was adopted by the Young Irelanders in 1848, and Thomas Meagher has given it this whole new symbolism, I think, and meaning when he's placed the white at the centre and he's talked about the white being the peace between the two. Now, in 1830, they absolutely had the same mentality and the same desires, but it just wasn't about, a completely independent Ireland. They had a different feel for that.
Okay. And then I want to talk about neutrality and Ireland in World War II. The first question has to be, was Ireland neutral in World War II?
It's impossible to say that Ireland was neutral in World War II based on the level of covert assistance that was going on to the United Kingdom and then equally to America when America joined. Saying you're neutral and actually being neutral are two entirely different things. And Ireland said it was neutral, but it did not remotely act neutral during the period.
Clearly Ireland said it was neutral. Had we gone further in terms of supporting the Allies, excluding the United States before 1941, I think it was, including the United States after that, would that have helped? Was the level of help, and we'll talk about what that was in a little bit, but was the level of help that Ireland gave, could that have been augmented by formally becoming part of the Allies?
No is the straight answer there, and that would be the opinion of MI5. That would not be my opinion. It was the considered opinion of MI5, who did a report called the Little Report between 1945 and 1946. Really ahead of its time thinking. They were basically saying, let's assess this now, let's let this inform future decision making if we ever find ourselves in a future war. Their opinion was that Ireland was a more use neutral. They came to the simple conclusion, and it's a very obvious one. Almost 10% of the Irish population left Ireland to go to the UK to take part in the UK war effort. Had Ireland been formally part of the conflict, those people, or most of them, would have had to have stayed in Ireland to defend the island from potential attack. So just on one instance alone, on one tiny little facet, you could see that Ireland was a more used to the UK neutral.
It's worth repeating that statistic. Almost 10% of the entire population of what became the Republic, the 26 counties, left Ireland and went to Britain, either, I guess, to join the British Army, but I think maybe mostly to work in factories, to women as nurses and so forth. That's what you're talking about.
Yes, about 2.5% left to join the military directly into the British Army, or of course the Royal Air Force and Navy, and another about 7% of the Irish population went to the UK war efforts. Now you have to remember that is putting yourself in harm's way, not as directly as joining the military, but no question these people would have been under no illusions what they were getting themselves into, particularly after the Blitz commenced and the bombing of British cities. So the notion of Irish sentiment being expressed in certain ways, and we often hear these rather trivial things brought up in regard to how there was a suggestion they may have favoured Germany. It's a nonsense when you compare it to the absolute realities of the number of Irish people going to be involved in the British efforts and the multiple other ways we helped.
It's fair to say those people were mostly motivated by a wage rather than by a desire to fight on one side or the other.
Yeah, there's a good spread of motivations, and no question that, I suppose the basics of a sense of adventure and being able to go off and earn decent money, because of course Ireland wasn't the wealthiest place in the world at the time. The two of those do come together, because look, it is certainly a more dangerous way to go and earn a wage. But again, that notion of connotations of a hatred of Britain or an anger with Britain that is so fervent that you will not move to the place, that you will not support them in any way. It is, it really is thrown into question by those kind of figures.
And the more, I guess, traditional understanding of the assistance that Ireland gave to the Allies, I suppose, number one was sending the fire brigades to Belfast when Belfast had been bombed. Also, British airmen and later American and basically all Allied airmen who crashed in Ireland ended up essentially being put in the back of a truck and told to walk across the border at Newry. That's the story that I have heard. To what degree does that represent the reality? Were all of those people sent back unofficially?
Yes, I mean, that is accurate. Absolutely. Those things did occur. And that was policy. That was very much the way things were done. Once the decision was taken that they were going back, there was a bit of a delay there. They were sending everybody back across the border. But that is so the light version of what Irish assistance was, and I think it's most exemplified in the intelligence sharing and the spying that we did on Britain's behalf. It would be no exaggeration to say that Ireland was an extension of the British intelligence services, and its territory was an extension of a watch place, if you like, a lookout post for British intelligence for the entire duration of the war.
Not to mention weather reports.
And weather reports, of course, and they became critical, when you came down to the likes of D-Day, of course, and the Black Sod report that came from Ireland. That was the breaking point. That was the decision point whether or not the invasion would go ahead, the most important military movement of probably the last, 500 years in Europe. So an incredible contribution by Ireland on those, what seem like small things, but when you piece all these parts of the jigsaw together, you recognize a government that has gone all in on its aid to one side and to one side only. I think what best and most importantly exemplifies this as well, William, is it was Ireland that started this. We approached the British government in 1938. Our intelligence services actually went across the UK and said, we would like your help to set up an intelligence service and a spying system on German spies in Ireland. And it went from there, from 1938 up to the point of Germany actually declaring war, which for a lot of people in Ireland, that's when any respect or affinity for Germany went out the window. You can't be a Republican or you can't be a democratic individual, as Ireland very much was in the 1930s and one of the few, and also stand over the activities Germany was taking from 1939 onwards.
Why did Winston Churchill portray it differently?
Winston Churchill had an agenda, as every politician did, and I think he's come from two different places. One related to the treaty ports, and we spoke about Spike Island earlier. Winston Churchill had visited Cork Harbour in 1912, and he saw the extraordinary amount of expense and development that went into defending that harbour. It's no exaggeration to say that there is nothing comparable in the UK. You've actually got 4 separate forts defending the second largest natural harbour in the world, so you could station entire fleets there. So he saw this incredibly important location and he was furious when the ports were handed back in 1938. He actually called them the sentinel towers of the defences of Western Europe. So you could understand his frustration and his anger, and even more so when Winston Churchill became the first Lord of the Admiralty yet again from 1939 until 1940. Now, he finds himself in a desperate situation where Britain is losing the Battle of the Atlantic, and he's blaming the treaty ports publicly, but there's an entirely untold story of the lack of British preparation for this upcoming war and for the Battle of the Atlantic. Within 2 years of the war breaking out, they had developed the technologies that they needed to win the Battle of the Atlantic. That should have been done between 1922 and 1938 when the ports were handed back. There was just no reason why. There wasn't some sudden magical, development. It was impetus, basically, and they found themselves on the back foot. So they needed a scapegoat, and Ireland was very much the scapegoat when it came to the treaty ports.
But in the victory speech in 1945, Churchill talks about Ireland frolicking with the Germans. By then he must have known that. What was the motivation for saying things like that? Was that just sour grapes or what?
Yeah, no, that is part of a coordinated plot. And that was actually identified by American Churchill historian Warren F. Kimball. He's a member of the Churchill Society, a very respected writer. In 2013, he spoke to the Churchill Society on effectively a plot line between Britain and America to diminish Ireland's effort for partition to be ended after the war. So they've come up with this idea that Ireland is now, we know Ireland is aiding us, but Ireland has taken an action that we can frame as, distrustful, as discreditable, as, an awful step to take. And of course, as the war progresses, that becomes even much more so, the end of the war in particular. So he is working with, in particular, the American ambassador, David Gray, and he's working with Roosevelt, who was on board as well. Now, for Churchill, it was all about partition. For Roosevelt, he was quite happy to see the Irish and American lobby diminished somewhat. This was not his lobby. He was quite satisfied to see their I suppose strength in Washington diminished, and there was an enormous amount of negative press about Irish activities in World War II in both the British and the American press. And what Churchill has done is he's taken aim at war's end, and he has really driven home the nail with that comment that Ireland frolicked with the Germans. He knew how it would be taken. He also knew it was untrue.
Okay, you mention in your notes, because of course this issue has been brought up previously on this podcast. We talked to some researchers, some I think Israeli-American researchers, who essentially held that Ireland was particularly anti-Semitic both then and now. And in your notes that you sent about this earlier, I can see that you're mentioning that 20% of the refugees that came at wartime to Ireland were Jewish. That percentage, I think, might be a bit misleading because the number of refugees who came was minuscule.
Yes.
And, to me, that's barely relevant. Ireland's record, whether it was to Jewish people or not, in taking in people in that period was just awful, wasn't it?
Awful, yes. And this was a policy in place since 1922, William. And I think they used the excuse of being a poor country to end up being a poor refugee ambassador, if you like, or a country taking people in. Now, the only defence we can offer them is that was applied consistently from 1922 right through up to 1939. And what they should have done was identify the scale of the emergency going on in Europe between 1939 and 1945. They didn't. This incredibly strict refugee policy stayed in place. I mean, they took less than 1,000 refugees at a time when the demand in total, yes, incredibly small numbers. So, it's a shame looking back, and we can see it for what it is. Now, we can offer some defense. They weren't making it up when they said that we cannot afford and we do not want to take in people who will become a burden on the state. There are other countries more equipped to do this. We should also, I suppose, issue the defense that no country took anything like the refugees it could have done. You have to level that at America, at Britain, at every nation globally. Absolutely nobody responded to the level or extent they could have, but Ireland was absolutely among the worst of a bad bunch.
Okay, and to the extent, and I think it is perhaps interesting, and it draws the eye and it draws comment to a much greater extent than its reality might justify. But to what extent did disaffected members of the IRA, or indeed the IRA that as it existed at the wartime, to what extent did they actually sympathize with Hitler? To what extent did they think my enemy's enemy is my friend? What was the scale of that?
It's very overblown, like the rest of the story, to be honest, William. At the end of the day, only the IRA leadership, a handful of individuals, cooked up this plot to go and seek arms from Germany. Very much, as I said, my enemy is my friend. I think they were thinking that they could avail of and take. I suppose they were opportunistic, really, in what they were doing. There is zero evidence that they had any affinity for Nazi ideals, and as I mentioned earlier, if you're a Republican, you should have no suggestion of working with individuals who are invading small countries. The sovereign rights of small nations, should be sacrosanct.
The Republicans of 1916 didn't have any qualms about taking arms from the Imperial German government at the time.
No, absolutely not. And I suppose what's flipped in the meantime is you have a Nazi Germany that has now shown itself and to reveal its true colours. I think it's fair criticism for the IRA leadership that they did take that route and go and seek arms and work with the Germans. We can't say that they worked with the Germans to further German aims or Nazi aims. There is zero evidence to suggest that they agreed with those aims. But the reality is they did collaborate with the Nazis for their own ends. Now, the scale of it, as I said, this was not. The IRA was a tiny group at the time. They were being arrested by the government. They were even being executed, and their membership is estimated at about 2,000 out of a country of 3 million people. They could have all fitted in a dance hall. So they're certainly not representative of Irish sentiment at the time. And even then, that sentiment that their leadership showed is not evidenced throughout the wider group. It's been suggested that if they had brought this up to the wider leadership, they would have been lambasted for even suggesting it.
Mm. And you mentioned there earlier about, your characterising Britain's, and Churchill in particular, their criticism of neutrality as, I think I use the word bad grapes, but also as being somewhat churlish. Are we maybe overstating Ireland's significance to them? Do they care really that much?
Churchill had a massive bee in his bonnet about those treaty ports, and I think it did seem critical to the war effort to him, is certainly 1939, 1940. Prior to America entering the war, prior to the Mid-Atlantic Gap being closed, I suppose he must have felt an enormous sense of responsibility, William, given that he was the First Lord of the Admiralty, overseeing these horrendous losses between 1939 and 1940, and then suddenly he's in the most senior role. Suddenly he's the Prime Minister and he's responsible for everything, and he's aware more than anybody else how critical the problems in the Atlantic are. So that puts Ireland right at the centre of this problem, and it's incredible to think we were given the treaty ports back. We didn't exactly go to war to get them back. They were handed back voluntarily by the British. But
this was about 1937 that happened, yeah?
Yeah, it was the negotiations began in 1937 and the formal handover was in 1938. So incredibly close to war. And it's almost, you have to wonder, had there been a decade between that bit of goodwill? Because within months of us getting the treaty ports back, we went to Britain to set up a joint intelligence service, and an intelligence service that would spy on German efforts. So clearly we were quite enamoured and we were delighted with this goodwill being shown by Neville Chamberlain. There's a very good relationship between Neville Chamberlain and between Eamon de Valera. So had that had more time to develop and then war break out, you have to wonder how things could have been so different. But Winston Churchill being such a confrontational character, and he had previous, of course, with Eamon de Valera, all of a sudden Ireland and Britain are seen as in conflict, and any aid that's going on had to be in secret then at that point. It is done in private.
Okay, and the diplomat David Gray, who was he and why did he matter?
See, he's a remarkable character. I mean, he was not a diplomat. He was actually a journalist by trade who got the role in Ireland because he was effectively married a cousin of Roosevelt, the American president.
So this was a little bit like ambassadorships are being given out these days. They are going to people with connections rather than people with qualifications.
Yes, he was absolutely not qualified for the role. He was a divisive individual. He was also ambitious, and what he wanted was the UK role. So Warren Kimball has come up with some significant evidence to show that he was angling to get the UK role by trying to impress Churchill and by trying to impress Roosevelt. And the way to do this was to try and basically drag Ireland into the war with all of these notions and ideas. It was his suggestion that Ireland should close its Axis embassies, legations as they were called then. He knew that would have to be refused.
The embassies like in Berlin and in Rome.
Yes, exactly. He demanded that the German embassy in Dublin be closed. He said he wanted to do this basically because he knew Ireland would have to say no, otherwise it would be a violation of neutrality, and it would put on record a moment of Irish, what seemingly looks like opposition, if you like, going against the Allied wishes. Now, what's incredible about that is the MI5 were actually spying on that legation. The Irish intelligence service had broken the codes and they were passing all the information. So there was this hilarious moment where Winston Churchill is informed, please don't close the German legation in Dublin because we are spying on it and finding it very useful for information. We're even passing misinformation through the Dublin office with the help of Irish intelligence. So, incredibly, they still went ahead and made that request to put on record an effort to discredit Ireland. And I think that shows the extent of the plot that was there, as brilliantly revealed by Warren Kimball.
But that was most certainly a faux pas by De Valera to visit the embassy to mark the death of Hitler.
Incredibly, yes. A ridiculous mistake when you think back with hindsight. It's almost heartening to hear that his other officials were advising against it. That it wasn't some overall Irish complete moment of failure, I suppose.
Yeah, but that also shows, John, doesn't that also show that this wasn't something that was done on autopilot, that, this was the thing to do when a foreign leader died. This was something which De Valera insisted on doing against advice, which shows that he had put thought into it and had really come up with the wrong answer.
Absolutely, it's a black mark against De Valera, and it's incredible to think he handled World War II so incredibly well. I've seen this in all of the literature elsewhere. I mean, the UK even, and in the US, those who have taken the time to review how he handled everything that was going on, steering Ireland through these unbelievably choppy waters, while also taking the correct course, of course, and supporting the Allies clandestinely, which he knew eventually was going to be released as part of the declassifications in time. Having done all that, to then make a decision, and I do think it's a personal decision, William. He had a close relationship with the German ambassador, and in his own words, as he said in a letter he wrote afterwards, which was only declassified 30 odd years later, he very clearly said that it would have been an unpardonable discourtesy to the German people and the German ambassador not to call. He's thinking in these really almost myopic terms of, what's right in front of him, and not the much wider picture and how this could be perceived. And it's been used against him and used against Ireland so much and so
Yeah, but
extensively.
it's hard to call it myopic because he had the advice available to him that this would
Yeah.
be received badly.
Yeah, I mean, you cannot offer a defense for his final decision. You can offer a defense for his thinking, and even the British ambassador actually gave a defense of De Valera at the time. He said, I do understand this. I feel it's overall incorrect, but I do understand why he's taken this action. So, even at the time, I think some people would have seen what he was doing was something he felt he should do. But of course, we've discovered since all of this kind of backstory of why it would have been an unpardonable discourtesy to not call on the German ambassador. And also
Mhm.
David Gray in the days beforehand had threatened to arrest the German ambassador, breaking all the rules of, diplomacy and neutrality and all the rest. So, there's a wider
So
story to
the
the whole
American
thing.
ambassador had threatened in Ireland, in Dublin, had threatened to seize the German ambassador.
Yes, yeah, the end of the war was imminent. Everybody knew there was only weeks left in this, and he had verbally put that out there in public that this was going to occur. And De Valera was, aghast at this suggestion. He felt it was ridiculous. He did offer the German ambassador asylum when he called to his house, and it's been suggested that it was more a personal call than anything else. But he, done under the auspices of a state call is what has resulted in it being so blown out to be something else. What it certainly wasn't, William, was, it's been suggested as an instance of Nazi support or German support, but there was no Nazi support or German support. We know for a fact that De Valera led a government actively working against the Germans, but that was hidden because he would not endorse Britain's partition of Ireland. Those are the facts. Anything else we try to read out of that is a supposition.
Okay. Um, I have, and I see that you have put it in the notes, and I'm not going to ask the question about how that impacts on the current politics, particularly the view within the Israeli media and maybe the American media that is more sympathetic to Israel about the view of Ireland. Because I think let's put it this way, that view is motivated by current events rather than past events. So I want to ask you a
Absolutely.
different question. I want to ask you a different question about the tricolour because of that, which is, and again, because you quoted the way how the tricolour was intended to signify a peaceful unity between orange and green. If you walk around Belfast or any other town or city north of the border, the tricolour most certainly doesn't signify that now. Do you think that that aspiration can ever be recovered?
I do is the straight answer, I suppose, William. At the end of the day, it's important for people to understand the origins of a symbol, and what that symbol was intended to mean. And if we're going to admit that any symbol can later be co-opted by a minority, and that minority can represent the majority and change the meaning of something, we would have to change national flags every 10 years if we allow that to happen. We have to set some ground rules, I feel. And if we're going to say that a symbol means something, it means that forever, irrespective of future actions. So, would the Union Jack still be flying over Britain today if we were to take every use of the Union Jack into account? Absolutely not, we wouldn't. So I do think that there's a reasonable argument there, but I would hope that most people in Ireland, if we are to go down the road of a united Ireland and we have those discussions, we should all be open to what represents Ireland and what the way forward is. Nobody should cling so tightly to a symbol or a flag that they don't get what they want at the end of the point of that flag, which is a flag of unity, certainly a flag of peace.
John Crotty, author and historian, author of Irish Tricolour and Spike Island, published by the History Press and Merrion Press. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you so much, William.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on X Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow John Crotty at It's John Crotty. And get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. It covers the cost of keeping the podcast going. And if you could throw in a couple of euro once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/Here's How. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.